Good morning and welcome. I'm Daphne Richards, Travis County Horticulture Agent with the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service in Travis County. Thank you for joining us for this webinar and our Texas Tough Plant series. With great program lined up for you today, native and adapted plants for Central Texas and wild-about plants. In the second half of our program today, I'll welcome Denise Delaney. But right now, I have the pleasure of welcoming our first presenter today, Skip Richter, my longtime colleague and dear friend who recently retired from AgriLife Extension to focus full-time on building his multimedia empire as the host of GardenLine on KTRH 740 AM. Skip spent many years as the Extension Horticulturist here in Travis County, and you may recognize him from his time on Austin PBS's beloved program, Central Texas Gardener. I'm beyond excited to kick off our series with you as the first speaker, Skip. So the stage is all yours.
Very good. Well, let's get going. I'm going to be talking about some of the plants that are very well adapted to Central Texas, including a lot of our native plants. Native plants that are native to Central and Western Texas, as well as some areas of the state, typically do really well in the Austin area. And we're going to focus on a few of those. Now, I asked Daphne for 3 days for my presentation so I could talk about all of my favorite plants, but needless to say, we're not going to do that to you today. So here is an excerpt of the plants that I think you will do well with, plants that are going to be attractive, that are going to be easy to grow, that are going to adapt to use a fancy word, the vicissitudes of nature in Central Texas. And boy, has nature ever been vicissituding us these last years with the freeze of February 21, the droughts that we've experienced, brutal droughts, unexpected cold weather that caught plants off guard. So we're needing a good palette of plants to do that. And so we're going to dive right in. One of my favorite plants are the columbines that are native to Texas. Red columbine you'll find in Central Texas, typically growing along streams where maybe there's a little brook on the side of a rocky hillside where water seeps out, and you'll find maidenhair ferns there and this little red native columbine, a Texas version of it. It's unique in that it has these long spurs on the back of the flowers that point upward. The flowers nod down and the spurs point upward, which is a really unique little feature, very attractive, but it's a very small flowered plant. The yellow columbine is also called Hinckley's columbine, and it is native out in the West Texas Big Bend area, but it does very, very well in Central Texas. It gets larger. While the red columbine may get about 1.5 feet tall, Hinckley's can get 2 feet, even more than that, a little bit if it gets really, really favorable conditions. Both of them like moist, well-drained soil. These bell-shaped flowers with the long spurs is their unique feature. Of course, with the Hinckley's, the flowers are oriented more outward, and you can see that here in the photo. The flowers are also much larger, and both of them have a beautiful bluish-green foliage that in the wintertime, when you're waiting on the blooms to show up in spring, the foliage itself is really attractive with those bluish-green mounds of foliage. Both of them reseed. So I would say both of them are weak perennials, meaning, or maybe I should say short-lived perennials. They will come back. You may get 2 or 3 years out of them, and by then they tend, for one reason or another, for that original plant to be lost, but new plants come along. So for that reason, I would say that while we say they prefer moist, well-drained soil, in dry summer shade, maybe underneath a mesquite tree or a retama or something else that's very drought tolerant, the plants may disappear, but then when the new seeds come up in fall, you'll be right back in business again. So areas that you don't want to artificially water, don't worry about these. With the reseeding, they'll come right back. They bloom from March until May. And one of the interesting features, I think, is that these two species will readily cross. And when that happens, you get something like this. It still has the red spurs of the red columbine, but the blooms, the yellow blooms, are larger, as you can see in the photo, and the plant's a little taller structure kind of in between the two, a little bit of the airiness of the red columbine. But I find that really interesting, so I like to put them together so I get some variation in what I see coming up year after year. Texas betony is a really great plant. It is native to the West Texas area, as well as Arizona and also in Mexico, southern Arizona. One of the nice features of Texas betony is that it stays rather compact. But if you shear it, it's even better. And you can create almost a ground cover effect by planting them about maybe 2 feet apart, 1.5 to 2 feet apart, and then shearing them regularly to get those beautiful red, which actually a coral red kind of bloom. It's in the mint family, as are our salvias, and things in the mint family often have aromatic foliage. And in the case of Texas betony, it does have a very aromatic, kind of spicy foliage that is really nice. But this plant, it ought to be used more because it really, really performs well. And when we talk about shade, because there's not good sunlight, getting beautiful color blooms when we go from sun into shade can be a little bit of a challenge because sunlight helps the leaves make carbohydrates, and carbohydrates are what drives growth and of certainly blooming, or in plants that fruiting. So finding plants that will bloom as we begin to get less and less sunlight is fine. Now, that doesn't mean it needs shade. It just means that it can grow well in shade. And it's going to bloom again from March all the way through the season to October. Another good feature. We have a lot of plants that put on a great show for a short time. Texas betony just keeps going. But I'm going to say this over and over and over during my presentation. Shear, shear, shear. Don't be afraid to shear your plants. So many of the great plants for Central Texas area do best if we shear them on a frequent basis. Just whenever Texas betony isn't looking so great, cut it back by about 1/3. And I don't mean just the flowers. I mean cutting into the foliage a little bit, give it a little bit of water, and it'll be right back again, blooming even better. Pink skullcap. Pink skullcap is one of several great skullcaps that are in the Austin Native and Adapted Plant Guide that all do well here. It's one of the showier ones. Pink skullcap is very compact, typically less than 1 foot tall, and it spreads outward, but more like a lava flow. So if you rather than a vine that's taking off everywhere, just imagine a very gradual oozing out of the plant as if lava were flowing across the ground. You can see it here in the picture at the bottom that it's going over some railroad ties that were bordering a bed. That photo was actually taken in Houston, Texas. And it just shows that if you give it good drainage, it'll grow just about anywhere. But like a lot of our good native and adapted plants for Central Texas, you're going to need to make sure that it has good drainage. That is important when you plant it. Semi-evergreen, and so it looks good all the time. The little blooms are typical of skullcaps. If you've ever seen a skullcap bloom, they all look very, very similar. But there you can see the beautiful, beautiful color of it, the rose red or rose pink color. And again, here we go, late spring all the way to fall. It never gets too hot for red skullcap, and it does get too hot for us to go outside in the summer. But this plant, full sun, it just does really, really well. Blackfoot daisy. This is a really cool plant. You'll see it growing out of the cracks in the rock. As you head west from Austin and you see the limestone outcroppings and things, this one will just be growing out of a crack in the rock. The one thing that it doesn't want is soggy, wet feet. You need to make sure that it has excellent drainage, whatever that takes. Putting a lot of extra grit in a bed, making sure the bed is raised. If it's all a low area, those of you who live maybe east of town on some of the flat blackland soils, give it a mound to grow on so that drainage is excellent and it'll do really well. It seldom gets over about 6 inches tall. Under good growing conditions, it just loads up with these little blooms that have a honey-like fragrance. I kind of think that's cool. Anything with small daisy-like blooms is going to be attractive to beneficial insects like hoverflies and tiny parasitoid wasps that basically, parasitoid wasps and aphids are like watching the movie Alien. Things don't go well for the aphid, this monster growing up inside, which I think is a good thing to happen to an aphid. That's a gardener's opinion. This blooms from March to November. Again, the blooms have a nice fragrance. If you get enough of them, you'll actually notice the beautiful fragrance. And typically you're going to see 8 white petals, and with the centers are always yellow. This looks a lot like one of the zinnias called narrow-leaf zinnia. It grows really low. That one comes in white, yellow, and orange types. So if you're around Austin, those are wonderful colors to set your heart aflame. But Blackfoot daisy is more of a perennial to a short-lived perennial. It does really, really well there. Zexmenia. I love this plant. Zexmenia is typically about a foot high. You can see it depending on growing conditions range. If you bring it into a garden and fertilize it a lot, it's going to get really lanky and rangy in its growth. And you're not going to be as impressed with the bloom. It'll always have some blooms on it, but they'll seem lost among all the green foliage. So the idea on this one, because it is a very woody stemmed plant, is to shear it back frequently. And that's true of many subshrubs. I'll mention that on some others later as I present. But the more often you keep these things sheared back, the better they look. That picture on top left is in a garden, but again, it's being neglected there, which is how it wants to be treated. The picture on the bottom right, I took that on Slaughter Avenue. And it was just an abandoned lot on the left. Slaughter Avenue is the street you see on the right. It's growing out of a crack next to the curb. So what does that tell us? It tells us it's tough. It tells us that it doesn't need a lot of water to survive. And what they did is they came along and they would mow this or weed eat that down, and they would just hack that thing down, and look how it comes back. So there's a cue on how you want to treat it in your landscape. Shear it back, make it come out with fresh new growth, and you will not see a prettier Zexmenia than that one growing outside of the curb right there. It is able to survive. Like many of these plants, no real significant disease or insect problems. Just don't put them in a swamp. They don't like wet feet. You want to prune it again. I mentioned that to keep it in flower. The leaves are very rough, kind of hairy foliage. It's kind of a unique sort of foliage feeling, but not that unique for plants that live in an arid or tolerate an arid environment. The golden yellow flowers are very, very beautiful on it. There's a variety of Zexmenia. The variety is Hispida, and it is more orange in color. The standard type would be a little bit more yellow, and I think you can kind of see the difference a little bit there in those photos on the page. Plumbago. I used to think that this plant had to be a wimp just because it just looked like some southern plant that ought to be somewhere where you plant azaleas and gardenias and other things. I was amazed. We had it in the landscape at the Travis County Extension Office one summer, and due to a line break, we lost the water in our landscape for like 60 to 90 days. It was a long time. And plants just turned to toast. And this one didn't look good. I thought maybe we were going to lose it. When the water came back on, we sheared it back and it just came right back. And I was very impressed with it. The color blue in summer is a rare color in our landscapes, especially in Central Texas. There's lots of yellows and oranges, but finding blue flowers in summer is unusual. This one creates not only blue flowers, but it also has a white form, a different form that's white. The flowers are in little clusters, sky blue. And at the base of a cluster, if you got little kids or grandkids, each of these individual blue flowers has a long little trumpet-like stem, and it's sticky at the bottom. So you can attach them to your earlobes, and now you have blue earrings, botanical earrings. So that's kind of cool. By the way, while I'm getting into it, the little lizards that run around, the anoles, you probably have seen those. They put their little red neck out. And if you tap them, they'll open their mouth and they will clamp onto an earring too, or as an earring, a reptile earring. And that works really, really well too. So you got to get your kids used to nature and having fun, and just a little free tips. That alone is worth the price of admission. You need to prune it periodically to maintain the shape. It can get a little floppy and open. It doesn't have the photo that you see has a nice kind of density to the plant. And that came with a little bit of shearing. Not real often, but just occasionally. Kind of watch your plant. It'll put up with a little bit of shade, and it just blooms and blooms and blooms again, all through the summertime. I'm going to go now to salvias. Salvias are my favorite genera of all the plants. You know, it's like asking a parent to pick their favorite child. Don't admit it if you have a favorite, by the way. But it's very difficult for me to admit what's my favorite plant. I get asked that question a lot. So I've decided, well, I will at least say my favorite genera is salvias. And there's so many. There's 100 different salvias that would do really well in Central Texas. There used to be one called Indigo Spires, and it was a great salvia, but it flops everywhere, and it would just make this big floppy plant, and it would bloom and bloom and bloom and bloom and bloom. And it was hard to sell because people, when they buy a plant, they want something with flowers on it. And Indigo Spires, even in a gallon pot, didn't look that great. And so it just never really made it to the mainstream. So they worked with developing it, and they came up with Mystic Spires. They've developed it further now and come up with a real small one called Misty. And if you look at the top picture, Mystic Spires is the one in the center, and the two little plants to the side of it on the far edges, those are Misty. Misty is a little bit, anytime we start breeding a plant to try to create one real specific characteristic, like in this case, small, we lose some of the other benefits of that plant. That just happens. But this one is wonderful. Mystic Spires is a cross with our native Salvia farinacea. The story goes that it went out to California to the Huntington Botanical Gardens. They planted Salvia farinacea out there. And suddenly, what happens in California stays in California. Something happened and this little plant pops up nearby. Well, farinacea had crossed with some unknown salvia at the Huntington Botanical Gardens. It's a good Texas love story. And as a result, they finally figured out what the parent was. But that is where we got Indigo Spires, and now Mystic Spires has been taken from that. One thing, I'm talking without showing you all my words here, getting so into it. It gets about the thing that I like best about Mystic Spires is it has a compact growth, but it has an upright growth. Now, all salvias can get a little bit brittle, so you want to be careful with that. If you got pets that are running through it, they're going to break branches off of it. But it gets about 1.5 to 2.5 feet tall typically. But I'll tell you this, in time, it'll get much larger than that. I've seen them 3.5 feet tall as well. But you could easily keep it in the 1.5 to 2.5 feet range by shearing. Each time you shear, you take about 1/3 of the branches off, or 1/3 of the height off, and it comes back. The picture in the bottom is what happens when you don't shear salvia, like an Indigo Spires or a Mystic Spires. See all those dead twigs, bloom stalks, and everything in there? And the leaves are old, so they're losing their nice green color. They're getting a little bit older in that parking lot island. But by shearing it and getting fresh new growth, it'll look more like the picture up on top. One of the few true blue blossoms that you're going to find. They continue to grow the stalk upward, the old flowers fall off, and new flowers are forming at the top of the stalk as time goes on. So that's why we want to do the shearing of it, the deadheading, if you will. If you want to go individually and cut them out, that's fine. I like to shear, water, fertilize, and get fresh new growth on the plant. Another great salvia is majestic sage. Majestic sage is Salvia garannitica. Sometimes it's called Argentine sage. Anise scented sage is another name for it. But we can't just leave plants with one name. We got to keep giving them more names. You're going to find this one much larger, 3 to 5 foot clumps. It can even get wider than that. It will grow in quite a bit of shade. And again, like all of the salvias I'm talking about, whenever you've gotten a winter kill back on the plant, go ahead and cut it back and get ready for the next season when it comes back. You can see the purple form. You can see the dark blue form. There's a variety called black and blue that's very common in the trade. There's another one called blue suede shoes or something like that is also similar to the top right photo. And then the one at the bottom is called Argentine Skies. See that kind of almost a sky blue with a little bit of the purplish hue in there as well. So that is one of the other versions of it. Hummingbirds love this plant. They absolutely go crazy on this one. And again, because it can do well in quite a bit of shade, that's a place where you can put it, and it gives it room to grow up larger, maybe in the back of a bed or something. And I think you'll be very pleased with it as well. Greg sage, also called cherry sage, autumn sage, Salvia gregii. It appears probably as autumn sage in your notes. I don't like either cherry or autumn sage. The original name cherry sage is because the original wild one was a cherry red. But there are many versions of color that are naturally occurring in this plant. And as breeders have crossed them, we get things from the fuchsia colors to the coral colors, as you can see in the picture. This one gets about 2 to 3 feet tall. Be brutal. Shear it back. I will cut mine back to about 4 to 6 inches in the winter. It'll come out, look wonderful in spring. By the time we get to about May, it will still be blooming. And so you got to bite the bullet and go ahead and shear it back by about another third. And then it'll come out with fresh new growth and beautiful blooms. Shear it back again at the end of August. And then fall will be another good blooming season. Don't wait until there's no blooms on it, because there's always blooms on it. It blooms from March through November. And with all these wonderful color options, it's a plant that really ought to be in every landscape, but most people don't shear it enough. There is a cross called Hot Lips. Now, I think your notes may say a variety. It's actually a cross with a Salvia greggii and another salvia, and it has white petals with red lips on the edge of the petal, and that varies depending on the temperature. During some springtime of the year, you get the red lips, and then when you get into hotter weather, you get more fully red and fully white blooms separately on the plant. Here's an example of what I'm talking about on shearing. The picture on the bottom left, the red salvia you see in the background is the same plant as the light green one coming out fresh. The red one is still blooming and it looks good, but we sheared one of the plants back. This was in the Travis County Extension Gardens, and I took a picture of the new growth coming out. Now, in time, that back plant, if not sheared, is going to get very woody, it's going to get leggy, and it's just not going to have a lot of blooms. But when you shear it, a little fertilizer, a little water, it comes out, and you see the picture on the bottom right. That's an example of plants that were sheared back. Look at all those blooms. So salvia, like roses and many, many other plants, bloom on the terminal, the end of a shoot. So if you have one shoot with blooms on the end and you shear it, you end up with 2 shoots, and each of those shoots has blooms on the end, and you shear those, and then you have 4 shoots. You see what I'm saying? Every time you shear it back through the year, you get more of a compact plant, you get more bloom terminals, and it just is tidier and much more attractive. Don't forget that on almost all of these Central Texas perennials. Salvia leucantha Mexican bush sage grows 4 to 5 feet tall. Beautiful silvery green foliage, kind of a spear or lance-shaped foliage. Well-drained soil like our salvias typically want. Purple or purple with white flowers. On the left is the more common purple flower calyx with the white bloom inside. On the right is the purple flower calyx with a purple bloom inside. It's a fuzzy little calyx too. It's kind of interesting. But these bloom in late summer and into fall. Any of our plants that are fall bloomers, and we'll have another one or two here in the presentation, they bloom because the nights get longer. We call them short day plants, but think of them as long night plants, and it will help. And here's why. It's not the short days that make them bloom, it's the long nights. So things like Salvia regula or mountain sage, that's a long night plant. Christmas cactus, Thanksgiving cactus are long night plants. Poinsettias are not long night plants. Copper Canyon daisy, I'll show you in a minute, is a long night plant. Mexican bush sage is a long night plant, or Mexican mint marigold, is a long night plant. And so if you have it next to a security light on your house and that light comes on at night, it never gets a long night and it doesn't bloom. And one year in the Travis County Extension Office, we had a mountain sage planted on the other side of a tree trunk. And the light that was at the door that was on all night shone on all of the plant except the shadow of the tree trunk right in the middle. And it bloomed like crazy in the middle, and the outside's got no bloom except way underneath on the back side where the light couldn't hit them. I'm going into some detail on that, but I want you to remember that if it's a fall bloomer, that's why it's blooming in the fall. And that's why you need to just be extra careful, because a lot of us have security lights or we have a motion sensor light. It doesn't take very long for it to split that night. And now you got 2 short nights instead of a long night in terms of the way the plant looks at it. Here's another one, Copper Canyon daisy, long night plant. It grows about 3 feet tall. This one flops. And it's just the way it is. You can see one there. The picture on the left is Zilker Botanical Garden. That thing is just flopping and sprawling, came over the red curb, and now it's crawling out in the parking lot. That's the nature of growth on that plant. We need a good compact version, but so far we don't have one. It is a marigold, and so that's why it has the genus that you see there. That's the genus for marigolds, and so it needs good, well-drained soil, of course. Once we get to about midsummer, we want to stop pruning it. And that's true of a lot of the fall bloomers, because if you keep shearing them, they won't have time to grow new growth and that growth mature to a point where it can set bloom buds to bloom in late summer and fall. So once we get to about midsummer on some of these things, you want to go ahead and stop any shearing that you're doing to keep it compact. Now, this particular plant, it's not that much to write home about through the year, but boy, when fall comes, does it ever load up with those little daisy-like blooms. Now, one thing that is interesting, I love the scent of this. Some people don't. It's a very pungent citrus pine scent. So if you can imagine maybe citrus rind with the pine needles and you crush them all up together, that's as close as I can get to describing it. Very pungent. As a result, deer don't like it either, which hooray for that. But it's a really, really good one that needs to be in our landscapes, because our landscapes, and I purposely put these things in the presentation, we need to have color from spring all the way to fall. So what I've given you is a lot of things that will stretch the season across from spring to fall, and then some things that just bloom in the fall. Don't ever neglect those, because in spring, anybody can have flowers. You can buy a fuchsia hanging basket in Austin, Texas, hang it out, and for at least 15 minutes, it'll look great in the spring before Texas summer arrives. Fall aster, another fall blooming, therefore a long night plant. Fall aster is about 2 to 3 feet mounded, and it spreads to the side. This picture you see is probably 5 different plants that are all clumped together, spreading out, and it's really just about in peak bloom right there. You want to cut it back in spring. Throughout the year, it's not much to write home about. It has little small leaves. They're a little bit on the fuzzy side, not so much hairy, but they just have a sandpapery fuzziness to them. When we get into the fall season is when it's going to do a show. So we want to be very careful not to over-fertilize it. Remember, these plants were growing in very arid, difficult environments. They were not growing in rich potting soil enriched with compost and water and fertilizer poured on them all the time. They'll respond to that, but they won't give their normal beauty when you overdo it. And that's what we want to stay away from. So don't overwater. Again, the little blooms with the yellow center, the daisy-like blooms. This one too, it's a small disc-like bloom. So it's always going to be a good guess that it probably attracts some beneficials. And if you look really carefully at the small picture in the top right, the center bloom has a tiny syrphid fly that is visiting that bloom. And boy, do syrphid flies love this one. They're one of the predators of aphids. But syrphid flies and many other beneficials love fall aster. Pride of Barbados. This plant can get up to 5 to 6 feet wide. With extra nutrition, they get bigger. I wouldn't recommend it. Keep it a little on the hungry side. It is a legume, and so it doesn't need a lot of extra nitrogen fertilizer, but what a gaudy bloom. I would say that if you put this in your landscape, you could fill the yard with pink flamingos and no one would notice the pink flamingos. Maybe the HOA, but I'm just saying. This is one gaudy plant. Very soft textured mimosa-like foliage to the compound leaves. It does need well-drained soil. And it loves Interstate 35. Some of the best pictures I ever take of this plant are in Austin and San Antonio and New Braunfels, where it just looks its best. Of course, it'll grow in Houston and it'll grow far west of San Antonio and Austin as well. But it loves your climate there. There are a few other versions of it. You can find a pink kind of version of it that's much less common. This is the more common type. It's just ablaze with color. One of the cool things about it is the blooms start off mostly yellow, and then as they age, they go very orange-red, and you can see that in that single bloom there. And swallowtail butterflies love this plant. If you want to see what a swallowtail looks like, especially the tiger yellowish striped swallowtails, they love this plant. It is cold tender. And in a very severe cold spell, you could lose it. I generally recommend mulching it at the base, and that way you're covered. Don't worry about it. When we go into winter and some cold occurs, just throw a bunch of mulch over the crown or base of the plant, and that will protect it, and it'll be back. But I say it'll be back. It'll be back about mid-spring. It sleeps longer than a teenager on a Saturday morning. It does not like cool spring weather, and you think, oh, I lost it to the freeze. Probably not. It'll come back, but it just really wants things to warm up a lot before it does. And the blooms just go on and on and on all through the summer. We're going to go now to Princess Carolyn Napier grass. This is a type of pennisetum. The nice thing about this one, it only gets about 2 to 3 feet tall, more upright than spreading. It will freeze to the ground, but it is dependably hardy in all but a rare winter, and you get lots of new growth. You don't have the bloom stalks on it, but it's the purple foliage that we go for. So to have purple foliage, you need good sunlight, don't put it in the shade, and you need to not over fertilize it, because as you push growth, and this one is on the verge of being too vigorous, that soil is a little too rich, you're seeing some green come out. It can be much deeper purple than that if we just wouldn't fertilize it. But remember, in Texas in summer, our bloom options decrease a lot. So foliage is our friend in summer. And there are a lot of great foliage plants. Don't have time today to go into all of them, but this is an example of one that's going to look pretty all summer, whether it blooms or not. And so just remember, depend on foliage when we get into the summertime for a lot of extra color. Frog fruit is a weed growing wild all over the place. I've seen it in parking lots, covering the asphalt. It's a small plant. It's also called matchstick plant sometimes, because the blooms are these little, like a matchstick on a stalk. They have little tiny flowers that are very attractive to many beneficial insects. I took that picture at the bottom in Houston, Texas, believe it or not, and it is just a great ground cover. So if you're looking for something that's more of a native, that's a ground cover, that's enthusiastic, that doesn't take over the world, that doesn't get too tall, frog fruit is an excellent choice. There are some other natives. Again, we didn't have time to go through all of them here in this particular slide set, but just remember, no matter where you're growing it, as long as it's not a wet spot, a soggy spot, frog fruit is going to do very, very well. And it'll even stay evergreen through most of the summertime, and it just spreads vigorously. But you don't have to worry about it taking over the world. It's easy to keep in check. Go now to the sedges. We've got a lot of different sedges. I chose Texas sedge because it's one of our native sedges. This particular one really is native all the way from the eastern U.S. across into Texas, but there are a lot of good ones. This one stays a little on the smaller side. It's about a foot tall. You irrigate it. No surprise, it's going to get taller. When you don't like the way it looks, just mow it. Just set a mower on there and cut it back. You can cut it about 4 inches high, put the mower on the highest setting, and you get a lot of fresh new growth, as you see in the picture on the bottom. It has little rhizomes that gradually spread out to the side. It's not a running grass, but it's more of a clumping. It's not a grass, it's a sedge, but it's more of a clumping form. Very fine textured, beautiful foliage. It can be used individually. I've seen it used in containers before, but it also makes a nice massed ground cover. If you've got some dry shade, it does well. You're going to find it in all kinds of places throughout this large region that it grows in, typically moist, sandy soil, but don't be afraid to plant it in a clay soil as long as it's got decent drainage, and it will do just fine for you. And other sedges, time doesn't allow, but things like Berkeley sedge, creek sedge, meadow sedge, there's a lot of other really good sedges that need to be used more in our landscapes. Turk's cap, what a beautiful plant. This one just goes and goes and goes. There are several types of Turk's cap. The typical type, Drummondii, has smaller blooms. There's a very tall blooming version that's a little more floppy. This one gets about 2 to 4 feet tall, blooms all through the season. Once it warms up, it's in the mallow family, the hibiscus family, so it likes things to warm up a little bit. Beautiful red or white hibiscus-like flowers. There's a white form. There's also a pink form called Pampurrier. Just take that red flower and make it pink, and that's what it looks like. And then there's also a kind called Fiesta that has variegated yellow and white splotched leaves. That's very unusual and not typically found, but it is available in the trade if you look. Magnet for hummingbirds. And it produces a little edible fruit, marble-sized fruit. Nothing to write home about. I always jokingly say edible does not mean palatable, but it is. It's okay. Yeah, it's okay. You can eat it. Thryallis. Boy, I love this plant. Thryallis makes about a 4 to 6 foot tall shrub, very loose, open habit that you can see in the picture on the left. You can prune it and prune it and prune it. You can prune this thing over and over and over again. Another terminal bloomer. and it starts to bloom. You can see on the right, that picture, yellow blooms, and look at that long stalk full of buds. It just blooms and blooms. So you can make it a 3 or 4 foot plant by shearing it regularly. It's not one that deer like. And these yellow flowers, I would say there's almost nothing I know that blooms for as many months of the year as Thryallis does. It just keeps blooming. Once it gets started in the spring, it's going to take some really cold weather to shut it down and stop the bloom show that it has. I want to give you a couple of roses here before we wind things up. I had to pick 2, so here are my 2. Marie Daly is a rose that was a found sport from one called Marie Pavier. Marie Pavier, I believe, 1888. It's a very old antique rose. Very small roses. They typically are going to make a plant that's about 3 feet tall is normal for Marie Daly. A fellow named Greg Grant, one of our East Texas extension horticulturists, found this sport and named it after, I believe, his grandmother, Marie Daly. And it's much pinker. Marie Pavier is more white with a little pink in it. This one has more pink than Marie Pavier. 3 foot tall, one of the best things about it is very few thorns and a really beautiful color foliage. So if you wanted to plant a little rose bush at each side going into the front door or walking along a path, someone is not going to get lacerated by rose thorns if they brush by against it. It has little tiny hooks underneath the leaves, very small, but you're not going to get blood when you brush through Marie Daly rose. And it is a polyantha type rose. The blossoms have a nice, I call it a baby powder fragrance. Sweet musk is a description. I think when you say baby powder, most people probably have smelled that and can appreciate it. And it's a good one. And again, with our shrub roses, that includes Marie Pavier, don't be afraid to shear them back. I would cut my Marie Pavier back by half in the winter. By the time we get through our April big bloom show, it's going to still be having some blooms on it, but shear it back by about a third. Water it and fertilize it, and you'll get more blooms in the summer. And then in August, toward the end of August, do that again, and you'll have a beautiful October as well. So roses, again, are a terminal bloomer. So every time you shear them, you get more shoots and therefore more blooms. And that kind of works really well. This one is pretty disease resistant. Black spot, powdery mildew are not going to be as big of a problem, especially the black spot is not as much of a problem on this particular rose. My last rose is Belinda's Dream. Belinda's Dream comes as close to being the all-around rose as you can get. I think the folks in Florida at Disney World said it's the best overall rose that they could plant. And Belinda's Dream, we say that about it because, number one, it's a shrub. So even if it didn't have a bloom on it, it would be a pretty green shrub. And we have a lot of green shrubs that don't have blooms. Number two is that it looks like a rose. Now, I appreciate roses in all their colors and shapes. Single roses like Mutabilis, semi-doubles like the Marie Pavier you just saw. Some people think a rose needs to look like the cut flower rose, and it really doesn't. It doesn't have to look like that. But if people want something that looks like a rose, take a look. There you go. There's Belinda's Dream. Belinda's Dream rose has a nice, beautiful foliage. It does get a little black spot, but not enough to require spraying. You want to keep from spraying the foliage. Anytime you wet the foliage of a plant, you increase disease problems. So don't put a sprinkler spraying the foliage of your shrubs, especially your roses, like this Belinda's Dream. But it is pretty disease resistant, not a lot of powdery mildew problems on it either. There's a picture of it in Fredericksburg up against that beautiful limestone wall. And boy, is that ever attractive. It's in a bed with some herbs. And by the way, that just reminds me to tell you, don't think that vegetables have to just be in a vegetable garden. Flowers have to just be in a flower garden. Roses have to just be in a rose garden. Mix things up. That helps with some of the disease issues we deal with and pest issues. It certainly supports beneficial insects better when you have a more diverse landscape. But these blooms are nice. They're not long stem, but you can cut them and bring them in. I think they look really well. Has a nice, fresh, fruity fragrance to it. And it just blooms again and again. This is another one. After the April bloom period, shear it back, fertilize it, water it, and get it back into another flush. At the end of October or August, shear it back, give it some water, give it a little fertilizer, and just keep it going. It's these two roses, I think, if I had to say, someone calls and says, hey, I got two spots I can put a rose in, These would be the two I'd recommend. There's only 800 others I'd love to tell you about, but these two, disease resistance, beauty, adapted, repeat blooming, and everything like that. And you're not going to be able to do better, I think, than these two. These both are also earth-kind roses. Earth-kind roses are roses that have been tested in harsh conditions by Texas A&M AgriLife Extension across the state. That typically in an earth-kind rose trial, they'll go out to a field like an old black clay soil up in Dallas is one place they do it. They mix in a little organic matter into the soil. They plant the roses, and the first year they give them supplemental watering, and they cover it with just wood bark chip mulch. Like the power line companies grind up those trees and blow it in the back of the truck to haul away. Yeah, we're not talking about pretty store-bought stuff. They throw that around them as a mulch. After the first year, they only water them if we go into one of those droughts that would kill anything. They'll give them a little water. There's no spraying and no fertilizing after that. And you ought to see pictures of the field. Some roses just are like, we're happy. Others are like, wait, we're prima donnas. Why aren't you pampering us and everything? And they don't make earth-kind status. One fun fact about Belinda's Dream is it was bred by an A&M professor, but not a horticulture professor. I don't know what they were doing in the hort department, but a math professor, Dr. Robert Basie, bred Belinda's Dream. And so interesting, it's a A&M bred, I guess you could say, but not a horticulture. It's just a hobbyist that did this. And some of our greatest plants that we have been bred by people that are not professionals. They are hobbyists that found something that they love. And I hope you have found a few plants that you love as we've gone through this. Daphne, I think I'm about ready to turn the thing back over to you, and I'll be happy to take any questions if we have any.
Well, first of all, could you advance to your last slide so that people can see how to reach you or how to listen to you on the fabulous radio program that you've left us for there on the...
How could I forget a shameless self-promotion?
Exactly. So it's wonderful to have you with us today, and I so enjoyed listening to your presentation, and I want to dive right in on one of the topics that you talked about. But first, I want to say that I was really, really happy that you talked about the importance of shearing. People are so nervous about cutting their plants and just to get in there and be fearless. But we did have a question about what if one has become really, really woody because it hadn't been sheared for years and it's more of a woody perennial. How nervous should we be? How far should you prune back a plant like that? It's not been pruned for years when it should have been.
That's a good question. I'm just giving everybody a warning. I'm going to take this off so we can have our faces on the screen here, Daphne. So hopefully you wrote down if you're interested in doing that.
And we'll send that to everyone as well.
Most of the plants I'm trying to think through the talk. Is there any plant this wouldn't apply to? And I can't think of any. You could take them back to the ground almost, and they're going to bounce back. Now, with a woody shrub, like a rose bush, I wouldn't cut it off at the ground. But if you even gave it a foot or two, it's going to sprout back out from the bottom. One time, cenizo, the Texas sage is real popular. Someone asked me if it would kill it to shear it back, and ranchers in Uvalde brush hog it regularly trying to kill it, and it will not die. It just comes back fresh and beautiful again.
That's great advice, because we do get kind of nervous, and looking for that new growth is very important on those plants. You see those plants, especially those Texas sages, like you said, with all the green leaves at the top and depth.
Yes.
Get in there and cut those back, huh?
Cut them back. Yeah.
Yeah.
Preferably don't let them get that way, but if they do, you can. It's going to take a while though. When you cut them back, they're going to sprout out. And remember, you got to shear them again as they're get about a foot high, cut it back a little, and just keep shearing them, or otherwise they just go straight up to the sky, and now you got a big plant again.
All right, next, how can we tell that plants are going to be drought tolerant? Let's say we're in the nursery, we're shopping, and we maybe have a list with us, but we find something that's very compelling. We want to maybe buy it. How can we tell just from looking at plants in the nursery if they're going to be drought tolerant or suited for our area? What's some of the things we can do to make a good decision in the nursery? Yeah,
well, first of all, I wouldn't go shopping without my handy dandy little native and adapted plant guide, because then right there, if it's a Texas native, that's good. And it's going to have mostly have some drought tolerance. You can look at the features of the plant. cacti, what do? They don't have leaves. They make their photosynthesis through the stems, and they got little thorns on them. If it has real thick succulent leaves, succulents are real popular now. They hold their own water, like an aloe plant would be an example. Other features include smaller leaves or leaves that are kind of fuzzy so that they don't lose water. But Denise is going to go into that a little bit more, but I'll just throw that out there as a first thought.
All right. That's great advice. Next question. What's the difference between sedges and grasses, both ornamental grasses and turf grasses? And is one better for certain landscape situations than others?
Boy, there's several questions, and those are good ones. Sedges, if you cut through a grass and look at the cut end of the stem, it's either round or oval in its shape. A sedge, when you cut through, is more of a triangle. If you have nut grass in your garden, I hope you don't, but if you cut through, that's really nut sedge. It's not a grass. It's triangular. So it's a different kind of plant structure. Sedges typically don't run as some grasses can run, like Bermuda grass and St. Augustine grass, just sprawl outward. And most of the sedges we would recommend in Central Texas that you would find Extension recommending over there, or the city Native Adapted Landscape Plant Collaboration Guide I showed you. Those kinds of sedges will often do real well in a partial shade, a bright shade too. Some of them can take full sun. If you're going to do foot traffic, you probably need to go to a really tough grass. Bermuda grass, that's why it's on football fields. Zoysia grass, that can take the traffic. But if I had an area and I didn't want to mow it all the time, I would use a sedge like Texas sedge and put stepping stones through it. And once or twice a year, cut it back with a mower to 4 inches high and let it come back out. And you'd have a super low, easy care landscape and still a place you could walk through.
Oh, that's really great advice about that. And I've seen lots of that in our sedges in sort of partial sun. And we got a really great question about partial sun, well-drained soil, full sun. Where can someone find definitions of these terms? And so I would just say that we don't define them because it's different. So why don't you talk about how to discern whether your part of your yard is full sun, filtered sun, has well-drained soil. Talk about some of those climatic things and ways that we can look at our landscape and try to discern what
That's
we actually
good. Yeah, you're right. The terms are confusing. And, we talk about dapple shade, we talk about part sun. And I always thought it was fun, part sun, part shade. What's the difference between that? They're both part of each. But that I would look more from the plant standpoint. The plant asks one question: how many foot candles of light am I getting, and how long are you giving them to me? Think of rain. Think of a rainstorm. If it drizzled all day, you can get an inch of rain. If it pours for an hour, you can get an inch of rain. And sunlight is that way. If you have a decent amount of light, not great, but you have it all through the day, the plant can do better than if you had just a little light and then it was real shady, but it wasn't enough. So you can't get all your sun in 1 hour, but I'm just saying it mixes together. So for a lot of plants, if you're worried about them surviving in the heat and sun, if you can give them morning shade, that's the best, because it's the cooler time of day. Once we get to 2 to 4 p.m., not only is it sunny, but it's blazing hot. And that's where the demands are hardest on our plants. So dapple shade, bright shade, morning sun versus afternoon shade, those are all kind of equal, but it comes down to foot candles and duration.
And I would say the best way to discern that is just to go into your yard regularly. I once heard a phrase, a gardener's shadow is the best way to keep your garden good to grow. And so Going out there and observing and making notes. And if you plant something and it doesn't do well, make notes on that, adjust for next year. I'm the queen of taking things out and replacing them and putting new things in when I didn't understand my landscape well enough to understand how hot or dry it was going to be in one place.
Right. And that's true. Turk's cap likes a little shade, but in a lot of shade, it gets kind of tall and lanky. In sun, it stays much more compact. Rock rose, not one of my plants today, but it's in the guide. You move it into the shade and you're going to have a lot of powdery mildew issues that you didn't have when it was in full sun. So there's other factors to note when you go to that sunshade thing.
So it's trial and error, unfortunately. So with that in mind, that trial and error, plants can be kind of expensive. Let's talk about buying small plants versus buying larger plants.
Yes.
what exactly should you do when you're thinking about buying plants a certain size for the landscape, but then also for containers?
Oh my gosh. If I'd come up with questions, I wish they would ask me. That's one. When you buy plants, you're buying dirt. Let me just let that sink in. I could have the same size plant in a 4-inch pot and move a plant about that size to a gallon pot. I'm going to pay 3 or 4 times more for that bigger plant, and I'm buying the dirt. So I know the bigger pot should have a bigger plant, but doesn't always. So the smaller the pot, the better off you are for economical, because you want to get more out of your gardening dollar. So buying smaller helps. Another thing you can do is when you buy smaller, aside from like patented plants that you can't propagate, you can put I bought one time, this is just an example, but I bought a gallon, what was it? A Duranta. And it had little branches going out to the sides, and I bent them down and I put a brick on a pot on each side of that Duranta. And I bent the stem down, kind of cracked it and set it on that, and it rooted in those side pots. So I got 3 plants before I ended up planting the thing. I got 3 out of it. So there's other things you can do to get more plants out of the ones that you have. But yeah, I would say in general, planting in the fall too is better. If I were to plant whatever, let's say it's a salvia, and I buy one that's 6 inches size in the fall and plant it, and then in the spring I spend a lot more money on a gallon size plant and plant it. By the time I get to May, you're not going to tell the difference between those 2 plants. And I save money by putting a smaller one in, but taking advantage of the fact that fall gives us a great head start.
Absolutely. And what about containers? Let's say we buy a 4-inch small perennial, like we're talking about doing, and we have a 10-gallon container that we want to put that in. Is that a good idea?
No. And it's hard to, especially our plants, a lot of these plants don't want to be overwatered. And so if you have this big pot and then you have this little plant root ball in it, the soil out here is going to stay soggy wet because it has no roots to dry out. So try to bump it one size container up as you go. And if you watch TV shows, you should only watch Central Texas Gardener. But if you refuse to obey that command, then when it's from the East Coast and West Coast and up north, and you see somebody put this plant on a little pot and it looks great, just say, I'm from Texas, and bump the pot up 2 sizes, because that's what you're going to need to get through summer here.
Yeah. Or plant it with multiple plants, the tall,
yes.
overflowing one, the theory there goes very well. And be careful in containers, because yes, we can very easily overwater all of these plants because most of them are, as we said, drought tolerant. Yeah. Not all native plants are low water use. So can we talk quickly here at the end, talking about what is the difference between a drought tolerant plant and a low water use plant? And are there any high water use plants that might be native to our area?
There are some plants that are truly drought plants that look good in drought. Most drought plants look bad in drought, but they survive it. They're able to come back and survive it. There are a few. Agave. You could dig up an agave, throw it in your pickup, and drive around Austin in July and August for 2 months, and then pull it out of your truck and stick it in the ground, and it's going to grow. But most plants, you just have to put up with ugly. Jill Noakes, who's there in the Austin area, says tawny is a color too. I always liked that, because a lot of our landscapes turn brown in summer, but that's okay because they bounce back. And if you're trying to save water, if you want your place to look like Atlanta, Georgia, move to Atlanta, Georgia, or get ready to spend a whole lot of money on water.
I like to tell people that remind people about summer dormancy. When plants are stressed, they go dormant. And plants these days are just as easily stressed, maybe more so in the summer than they are in the winter. That's a natural occurrence for them to hunker down and go dormant in the winter. It's maybe a little unnatural, at least for us to observe, for them to do that in the summer when it's dry. But the winter is dry as well. And so they're protecting themselves, doing the same thing in the summer.
That's a good point. There's heat and there's Texas heat. It's hot. The nighttime, the nighttime heat, when it's 80 degrees at the end of the night, that is really hard on plants to not have that cooling off at night with their respiration and that they go through. That's a stress. We get things all the time. You see this new petunia is heat tolerant. And I always want to tell the company, send me a few. I'm going to be grilling out next weekend. I'll throw them on the pit with the burgers and close the pit. And 5 minutes later, if I open and they're still looking good, I'm interested.
Then they'll do well in our Texas summers, that's for sure. So let's loop back just to wrap up and connect that back to the full sun versus partial shade. And our full sun summers are very different than where that plant, that annual, that tender perennial might have been grown in a different nursery further east of us, further north of us. And so to make sure that you do a little research on those plants in our Native and Adaptive Plant Guide, or call your local county extension office to see, is that our full sun or is that someone else's full sun that on the label that says this plant can be grown in full sun?
Yeah, I appreciate that. One quick thing along those lines I'll leave with too is when you put a plant in the ground, the whole root system is right there still, whatever size pot it was. And people think, well, this is a drought tolerant plant. Well, when John Wayne was a baby, he wasn't the tough hombre that he was in the movies, right? He had to grow up and establish. And those plants, that Blackfoot daisy growing out of the crack in the rock, developed a really good root system before you saw the beautiful thing up on top. And we can't just put them in the ground and go, they're drought tolerant and walk away, with very few exceptions. We need to help them get established, then they're on their own.
Very good summarizing point. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions with you, Skip, today. And so up next is our second speaker, and Denise Delaney. But Skip, if you're going to hang around, I'd love for you to hang around with us. But if not, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. And up next is our second speaker, Denise Delaney, with the City of Austin's Watershed Protection Department, where she's currently serving as the Acting Education Program Manager. Welcome, Denise. I'm excited for your Wild About Plants presentation. So take it away.
All right. Well, thank you for inviting me to be a speaker today. And I just have to say, Skip, that was wonderful. I miss you so much. I forgot how funny and awesome you are. And for those of you that don't know, Skip and I met back in 2002 when Grow Green was just starting. He was extremely instrumental in making our program happen. We are still partners with the AgriLife Extension office and the Travis County office and the amazing master gardeners, that help us promote our program. This program wouldn't be the success it is. And then seeing you, Daphne, it's been a while. It's great to see you. And then Cheryl, thank you so much for all that you've done to put this together. I am just I'm kind of beside myself. It's kind of like going down memory lane, but very happy to be here. I am wild about plants. I'm a horticulturist. I've been in the Austin area for almost 40 years. I moved here in 1985, and it's been quite a journey, I have to say. So I'm also Irish, and my birthday's in May, so my gemstone is an emerald, so I'm about as green as you can get. But I'm also with the City of Austin, with the Watershed Protection Department. I have been with the City of Austin almost 20 years, and the Grow Green program is about that old, so I've been with it most of the time. But Watershed Protection is a really special place. When you look at the City of Austin, we have water conservation in the Austin Water Department, and they make sure we have water. They do water conservation programs and low flow toilets and that kind of stuff. Well, Austin, I call Watershed Protection, they help us conserve water. Watershed Protection helps keep it clean. So our mission in the Watershed Protection Department is to protect lives, environment, and property from flooding, erosion, and maintaining our water quality. So just want you to think about in Austin, like a special place that you like to be outside. Is it any place that has to do with water? Could it be Barton Springs or the Greenbelt or Lady Bird Lake or Lake Austin or McKinney Falls? And so that's our job at Watershed, is to make sure that this water stays clean. And so we take that job very seriously. And part of the seriousness of that, besides the water quality, is that this enormous amount of water that comes down in a hurry hits our landscapes, and a lot of it runs down into our creeks, causes huge problems with flooding. But it's not just flooding. We live in Flash Flood Alley. I want you to take a look at this map. This is like by the National Weather Service declares this. This isn't just like, oh yeah, we get a lot of rain. It's a very serious problem. And the more we put development down and pavement and, the less place there is for water to sink into the ground, the more flooding we're going to have. So I'm not going to go on and on about this. I just want to bring it to your attention. And also this really great website, ATX Floods, if you're ever out driving and you have to go somewhere when it's raining heavily in Central Texas, please look at this app. It's in-time weather responsive, where the low water crossings are, which ones are open, which ones are closed. We'd rather that you stay home, but if you do need to go out, then you really need to know about this site. So I just wanted to make sure that you guys got the flooding part of our mission and the great resources that we have. But the water quality part of it is why Grow Green is in the Watershed Protection Department. And the thing about it is, so we have these landscapes, and anything that we put on the landscape, well, most of it that doesn't soak into the ground or go into like a rain garden or something goes down the streets into the storm drains, and our storm drains go down to our creeks. And I think that connection is something that not everybody understands. So if your neighbor's pouring motor oil down the storm drain next door to you, it's going to go down and end up in our creek and cause lots of pollution problems. So for landscape issues, fertilizers for sure. And if we have time, I might talk about the toxic algae problems that we have in our water. But it's also pet waste. And it's also, like I said, motor oil. It's, all kinds of problems. Sediment actually is one of the biggest polluters when we have construction sites and they let the soil wash down into the water and makes it cloudy and uses up oxygen. So that's a problem. So having this awareness that what we put on our landscapes ends up in our creeks and thus our water supply is something to be noted. But as far as Grow Green, we're trying to grow green to keep our water clean. We want to promote healthy landscapes. And of course, that means soil, because there's a whole world going on underneath the ground there. A lot of people don't think about our people, our pets, our wildlife, our waterways. We all want these things to stay safe. And keeping the water clean is one way to start doing that. So we support integrated pest management. That means we don't use toxic pesticides. We don't use salt-based fertilizers. Not saying we never use a pesticide, because there are least toxic ones. If you use it at the right time and strategically, they can be used if needed. We try to avoid that whenever possible, but there are some that we can use if we need to. I said a while about plants, and you guys can have access to this presentation, but I just want you to think about just for a minute, like plants, they're only the foundation of life on Earth. Right? Like they don't get enough credit in the biological world, I don't think. I mean, everywhere you look, there has something to do with plants, whether it's, the table that you have or the food that you're eating or the guitar that you're playing. Plants are everywhere and they're super important. And so it's just great to remember that. And then horticulture as a science. When I learned what horticulture was, it's, the art and science of growing plants, but it's also the business of plants. And so there's great careers to be had in horticulture that are very satisfying and, have to help support all these different industries. So I encourage you, if you have young adults or anybody that's looking for an interesting career, that horticulture is a great place to start looking. It could be botanical gardens or golf courses or, working in a place like Watershed Protection. So back to the plants. Skip held up one of our former versions of the Native Adapted Plant Guide. This is the current version, and I'll be happy to let you know that we're working on a revised version. The last time we revised it was in 2012. And so we were due. So we are doing an extensive stakeholder survey. We're going through lists, we're talking to people, and we're updating it. It's not going to come out this spring for sure. Maybe the fall, maybe the next spring. It's a huge undertaking that we're doing. But I just wanted to let you know that we are doing that. We do have this available online in a PDF format. And when they send out that email to everybody, there will be a link to this. So when we're looking at plants, and I just love Skip, I love to hear about all the details of the plants. I'm kind of taking a little bit bigger step back on how we talk about plants. And this is the content key in the plant guide. And so just to go through, we have all these different categories. And when somebody was asking about the ornamental grasses and the turf grasses, just wanted to add that, we have the turf grasses, and then we have bunch grasses like big muley and pine muley, and they stay in a clump. And then I also include the prairie grasses like little blue stem and side oat scrama that are more adapted if you're going to have a pocket prairie in an urban landscape, because those are going to reseed, and those were foundation grasses in original prairies. So you might not want to put Cytops grama in as a landscape plant, but you might want to plant it in as part of a pocket prairie. So the turf grasses, like you said, they have runners and stolons and they spread, but then we have the bunch grasses and clump grasses that are also called ornamental grasses. So we use these terms overlapping sometimes. Sometimes it's a little confusing. So hopefully that helps clarify some of that. In the native section, Skip was talking about, we have the Edwards Plateau, we have the Blackland Prairie, and so we have different soil types. So in the plant guide, we have them designated if they're from the Edwards Plateau, if they're from the Blackland Prairie. We've found that there's some that are native to both, so they're a little bit more flexible. If there's a T there, it's native to Texas. And I'm going to show you the ecoregion map of Texas to remind you that there are lots of diversity in our ecoregions, thus lots of diversity in the plants that grow here. And then, like he was talking about some of those hybrids, like the Mystic Spires, that one of the plants has a native parent in it. So in the plant guide, we put an X there for the hybrid. Of course, height and spread. The utility approved trees are generally under 20 feet. We run that by the Austin Energy folks because, you don't want your trees under your power lines to do some interference. I have another slide that talks about the light. That's a sensitive subject. It's because there's such a spectrum. And I think, Skip, you did a great job of kind of trying to explain that. I did want to mention at the Austin City Libraries, you can go check out a light meter, and you can take the light meter to your garden and it will help you determine what your light is. It's kind of neat. And there's some other things that go in that. I don't know, Katie, maybe you can help me remember what those things are, but you can go, there's a water meter. There's a water meter and like a flow meter that you can check how fast your water is coming out of your faucet. And then, just is it evergreen? Is it semi-evergreen? Is it deciduous? I think it's interesting, like Skip had said that the pink skullcap was semi-evergreen, and I wouldn't think of it as being that, but plants respond in different ways. Like for the longest time in the plant guide, I had Texas oaks, live oaks were evergreen, but then somebody said, well, they're semi-evergreen. Well, they're shedding their leaves and then they're going to be green again. So I guess we're calling that semi-evergreen. But the one I think of the most is crossvine. In the wintertime, it'll have some of the leaves and not some of the leaves. And so that's semi-evergreen. But what I can tell you is the plants don't read our books, that they are out in the environment responding to their circumstances, and they don't always fit in these neat little categories that we like to put them. Enough about that. But I do want to talk about the native, adapted, and non-adapted controversy, because I know there's lots of people that are like, just natives. And I agree. We should always use native plants whenever we possibly can. And I was at the Wildflower Center for a few years, and I got to spend a little time with Mrs. Johnson. And I can tell you, I swear she was not a purist either. She was a very practical person. And so I think whenever we can, we should plant native plants. Actually, it's funny. I have the old picture of the plant guide up here. But the adapted ones, I think about them like people. Like some people can live anywhere. Some people are very particular. I think of adapted plants as like your relatives that move here that aren't obnoxious. Like they live here and they're okay and you can get along with them, but they're not just like driving you crazy. So that's what I would consider a non-adapted plant. And then not adapted would be like a peony. Like I'm from the Midwest. We had peonies and you just cannot grow them here. It's way too hot. I worked on an estate where this woman here in Austin wanted to have peonies in her garden. And I tried to explain to her the conditions were just not right. And she said, well, I want you to take the ice from the swimming pool refrigerator and put them over on the peonies so they'll get the cold treatment so then they'll bloom. Well, had I been thinking at the time, I would have just told her I was doing that, and then I would have went and bought some cut flower peonies with the floral tubes and stuck them out there one morning and said, look, Mrs. C, you've got peonies because I'm amazing and I can make anything grow. But that wasn't the case. Another one is, this is a water oak. And I took this picture here in Austin. This poor thing is not happy here. It's not much more for the world. Once a plant turns that yellow and doesn't have any chlorophyll and can't photosynthesize, it's just not going to be happy here. So, we have folks that come in from other parts of the country and they don't know any better. So we're hoping that they will check in with us because we can let them know ahead of time that that's just not going to do well here. And then I included the bougainvilleas. This picture is around a swimming pool here in Austin, and they're tropical plants. And so you have to, if you want to grow those here, you have to take those containers in before it freezes, protect them somehow, or just treat them like annuals. If they freeze, you're going to have to replace them. Versus this picture down below, I think I took that in Santa Barbara, California, and they never freeze. So they're bougainvillea trees. So we're not saying you can't grow them here. We're just saying that they're not going to end up being like that. Well, so then as far as native plants go, here's that map I was talking about. So, we're kind of in here in this, between the Blackland Prairie and the Edwards Plateau. I put this picture in here because just to show native plants in their native environment. So this is a Damianita growing out of a rocky hillside. This is a Damianita actually planted at the front entrance of the Wildflower Center, and it was planted in caliche, and so it's happy. And when Skip was talking about buying soil, ideally these plants that we'd be buying in the nurseries, instead of it growing in nice, rich potting soil that they use, it would be growing in caliche, but that's too heavy. They wouldn't be able to ship it, and nobody would want to pick them up. But that's where that plant really wants to be. That Damianita, like Blackfoot daisies, they don't want to be in potting soil that's really rich and moist. They want that good drainage. And so the growers have a little bit of a challenge in the mixes that they use. It really has to end up being well drained. And then this is a picture I took. This was in South Austin. And I just wanted to note that native plants are awesome. But a lot of times of the year, they don't look so great. They're a little scruffy and rough. This was in the fall right after it rained. So a week before, this landscape did not look like that. But you know how our native plants are. Once they get some rain, they just get crazy and bloom. So we just have to make sure we give people realistic expectations about how things look at different times of year. And then as far as native plants, I think just with climate change and things getting hotter and drier, we're going to see the plants that grow in West Texas and south of here are going to be the ones that are going to fare better. It just makes sense that they would do that. And then this is just to remind you about habitats. When you're out and about, you're out in hill country. I took this off of River Hills Road on the way out to the lake one day. And I just thought, how awesome is this? Here's your landscape design already for you right there. There's that Damianita that I had just showed a picture of. There's a Blackfoot daisies that Skip talked about earlier. Antelope horns, oh my gosh, once you learn that plant, you will never forget it. They look like big snowballs alongside the road. And I have it on good authority from someone in our wildlands division that this is one of the best plants for monarch butterflies. It is a Asclepias, but I didn't realize on top of the regular milkweed that this is one that we should be planting more of. And then, you guys were talking about plants and getting plants, like plant more seeds. Plants are expensive and they've gone crazy, and, dividing them and being able to propagate them is great. But I think we have to use more seeds too, because they are a good way to get more native plants out into the world. And then here's the pink skullcap. That's the cousin to that. Or here's a purple skullcap. That's the cousin to the pink one that Skip mentioned. And then this gorgeous agarita. You can't tell, but it's blooming like crazy in that picture. And there's bees all over it and it smells fantastic. So when you're looking for plant combinations, look to nature for inspiration and look at them. They're growing in this limestone, caliche, hard, rocky soil. So that's a good indication of where you should think about planting. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about invasive plants. I call them bullies of the plant world because they do well. We want our plants to be tough. We're a little conflicted about it. We want our plants to be tough, but not too tough. We want them to do well, but we don't want them taking over. Now, I'd like to remind people that, most of these plants you can go buy at the nursery. Look at it from a nurseryman's perspective. I want a plant that I can grow, that will grow in a pot, that will grow fast, that anybody can come and plant it just about anywhere and hardly do anything to it, and it will do well. Well, there you go. Those are the plants. But that's not good when they take over and choke out other plants and habitats. And this is just a list of the top 24 that we had here in Austin. This was after a survey that was done by 30 interns one summer, but there are definitely other invasive species. The legislature made us put this at the bottom in 12-point font. This plant list is only a recommendation, has no legal effect in the state of Texas. It's lawful to sell, distribute, import, or possess a plant on this list unless the Texas Department of Agriculture labels the plant as noxious or invasive. So I'm not trying to promote those plants. I'm just saying that, it's all about education, educating the public and educating you guys about why we'd prefer that you didn't grow some of those plants. And then we've also offered in the plant guide some options for some alternatives. And I wanted to mention too that early in the plant guide, we had Chinese pistache was in the very first plant guide. And when we realized that it was an invasive species, we took it out because things change when you get new information. Another good example of that is Vitex. We have Vitex in there for a long time. And then, our staff out in the wildland areas, the city of Austin owns tens of thousands of acres of property that we manage, and they were starting to see Vitex invading the natural areas. So we're like, okay, we hadn't seen that happen before. So we need to, take that off of the recommended list. We try to find the middle ground. Like if you're in the middle of Austin and you're not next to a green space and the chances of the seeds getting washed down are less, then, you have to use common sense, but also just have an awareness of why we would prefer that you don't use that plant. Okay, here's the light condition slide. So this is a little tricky because there's a spectrum. And like I said, the plants don't read the book. So they're going to be out there doing what they can. So I first want to talk about just the different layers that you have in a landscape. So you have your shade trees, and then you have your understory trees, and then you have your shrubs and your ground covers. So you're going to get different levels of lighting. Also, it changes over time. Like this aspidistra or this cast iron plant, I took that picture in Travis Heights after, unfortunately, an oak tree got cut down because of live oak. That cast iron plant was used to being in the shade, and it was doing just fine, and it was very happy. And then when that tree came down, all of a sudden it's getting more light and it's getting scorched, and the leaves are turning brown. So, a lot of what we know about plants are just going out and planting them and moving them around and changing things. But we have to remember the landscape changes too. The tree gets bigger. It causes more shade. That makes this area different than it was before. It's a dynamic process. And I think that's part of what makes being out in landscapes fun, is that they are changing. But it also can present some challenges if you're a gardener. So back to the sunlight thing. So we're saying that plants that say they need full sun, they need at least 6 hours. I mean, there are plants that would prefer more than that, but we're just going to give you a good kind of at least 6. And then we have that sun partial shade. And I think Skip did a great job. I didn't add dappled in here, but it's really like the total amount of light that it gets. So sun to partial shade is 4 to 6 hours of sun. As he mentioned, preferably it's earlier in the morning or early afternoon. That late afternoon sun we know is brutal. And then full shade, less than 3 hours of direct sun, but it could also be filtered. I mean, there's a certain point at which, the plants can't get enough light to photosynthesize, but you will see plants in the shade have a much bigger leaf surface area because then they have more area to collect the sun rays. This picture, this is big muley. So this is one of those clump grasses that I was talking about. Fabulous grass. It's planted all over the place. It's just a really good Texas tough staple. But over here, you can see which ones are getting more sun and which aren't. So if a plant prefers full sun, then it's going to bloom more. It's going to do better in some, but that doesn't mean it won't grow in some shade. And like Skip mentioned about the rock rose, it does really well in the full sun, but if you put it in the shade, sometimes it gets some powdery mildew. But if it's in part sun, part shade, and it has a little breeze go by it, then it may not have the powdery mildew. So there's a lot of circumstances around the conditions of that particular plant that can have an influence on it. So hardiness. So there's cold hardiness, there's heat hardiness. I know that there's a new heat hardiness rating for our area. And I thought, rather than go into all that detail, I'm going to talk about the things that affect us when we're taking care of plants. So all plants, the hardiness is genetic to the plant. So obviously some plants can handle cold better than others, but they all have an optimal temperature that they need to grow. But most plants max out at 86 degrees. So once it gets super hot, those plants, like Daphne was saying, they're shutting down. They're not photosynthesizing. They're not doing anything. They're just like, it's too hot. I'm not dealing with it. I'm just not going to do anything until I get what I want. So that would be a case. The plants aren't actively growing really at that time. Once it gets to be 86, they just shut down. But hardiness is also a factor of how well established the plant is, how mature it is, its general health, how, what kind of moisture level that the soil is at the time. So there are lots of things that can influence hardiness. So just a couple of those microclimate factors. One has to do with the slope. So if you've got plants that have a south and west facing from the slope, their slope is south or west facing, they're going to keep growing. But on the other side, you can see conditions are quite different. And so the plants are not growing. The color of the ground, well, that makes sense. If you're on a beach that has black sand versus white sand, there's going to be a big temperature difference. Also, the soil moisture level can have an impact on that. Large bodies of water. I took this picture out. This is like overlooking Lake Travis, like out there at Hippie Hollow. And so this big body of water has an impact. It has an impact on the plants that grow near it, like the lake effect. So it acts as an insulating factor if it's close enough. And then altitude, when you're up in the mountains, you can see it's going to be colder up high. Proximity to buildings. I put this in here just as the heat island effect. And so the plants in this general area, but also plants, on the south side of and south and west side of buildings are going to be able to handle, they're going to be more protected. So they'd be less likely to be influenced by temperature changes. And then the surrounding vegetation too. And so this graphic, I was looking at it this morning, it had Celsius. So I changed the numbers. But if you're looking at bare soil, that soil could be like 118 degrees. If it's underneath a shrub, then it could go down to 84 degrees. If it's under a shrub that it said leaf litter, but that's like mulch, it could be 80 degrees. If it's under a tall shrub, then it could be 70 degrees. So there's a big difference in, bare soil versus covered soil. And I also just wanted to mention synthetic turf can get up to like 120, 140 degrees. So I'm not going to talk about the evils of synthetic turf, but there's just one reason right there not to be using it, because it's the off-gassing of all the plastic and stuff. It just doesn't make any sense to me. Okay, so talking about heat. So we experienced that this summer, didn't we? In our plants, I was amazed that the turf grasses recovered. Not all of them did, but especially like the ones like the Bermuda grass, that have the underground rhizomes. I know the St. Augustine didn't always fare as well because it's got stolons that run across the top of the yard. But I was pretty impressed with how our plants recovered after the extreme heat and drought that we had this summer. But plants will respond to that. They're pretty tough. Like I said, they've been dealing with a lot of these conditions and adapting to them for a long time. So just to review the way that plants respond, well, some of them will just wilt. Some of them will curl up their leaves so they lose less water. They'll get sun scald, just basically burn. They'll drop leaves like sycamores. You think about those giant leaves on sycamores. As soon as it starts getting hot and dry, they're like, I'm getting rid of these leaves because they're making me lose water, and I'm not wanting that. Heat can also make plants bolt or send up their flowers sooner than they normally would. And then the extreme air and soil temperatures also slow down the chemical activity in the growth. So we talked about the growth. So above 104, many plants will survive, but they'll start to show signs of heat stress. So there are limits to what they can take, but I have to say I'm pretty impressed with our plants and how well they put up with all of the challenging conditions that we have here for them, including cold weather. And so plants have different ways of responding to cold. Sometimes this is a hibiscus. Sometimes, if the temperature just goes down and goes back up, a lot of the new growth will get nipped, but the rest of the plant's fine. So once this freeze is over, or the danger of freeze, you can cut these back. You can cut these all the way back, pretty much like Skip was saying, down to like the basic structure of them. But if you have a plant like this cacti, the plant cells have water in them, and certain plant cells, when they freeze, they burst. And so that makes them mushy. So this plant is not going to ever recover from that. So you can leave it out there in your landscape, but it's probably going to start to rot the top of it. So you just kind of have to say, well, it's kind of like being an urban farmer. Sometimes you can't control what the weather does, and you just have to roll with it. And then there are situations like this sago palm. So I took this in a it's next to a taco place. You could see it was in an urban area. It was protected because it was around concrete and there was a road nearby. And I thought, oh, is that going to make it? Because it looks like it completely froze. Well, if you have this situation, I would recommend that you leave it until, new growth starts to come out, because that old foliage is kind of protecting the crown of that plant. But once it warmed up, this plant came out of it, looked great. This got trimmed off and you could hardly tell it got frozen. I put this one little picture over here in the corner because I found this fascinating, that the plants that can take the cold weather, they have some kind of antifreeze in their cells. And so that's why the plant cell, the vacuole in a plant cell doesn't freeze, because it has antifreeze in it. They're so clever, those plants. They do so many things. Oh yeah, here's a good picture. So yeah, here's a plant cell. So here's an animal cell, here's a plant cell. There's the vacuole. That's that whole, it's just like a big pocket of water in there. And so that's where you would find that antifreeze type liquid. So as far as, we talked about heat and cold, what about drought? And what about flood? Because we get both around here. This picture, I think, it was Lake Travis back in 2011. We had a pretty bad drought. I've kept this same graphic in here. Skip, you probably recognize this from way back when. This is from 1940 to 1995. And it's really just to demonstrate drought, flood, drought, flood, drought, flood. That's what our rain pattern is here. Now, I can say these are more extreme now than they were, so I probably should update it. But just that's what our plants have to deal with too. So like we're talking about rain gardens and people think, oh, I need to plant something there that can take a lot of water. It's like, well, most rain gardens are dry about 98 or more % of the time. So you can't base putting a plant that likes to be in water in the bottom of a rain garden, because they're also designed to only be full of water for a day or two. It's a little bit counterintuitive. And I have this slide in here just to mention that, we get about 32 inches of rain here in Austin, but Seattle gets 36. They get more than us, but they get theirs all spread out and misty. And, it comes down just a lot different rain pattern than we have here in Central Texas. So if you've been around here anytime, you know about our floods. If you're new to Central Texas, like I said, please inform yourself about what happens when we have flash flooding and how to stay safe. It's very serious, and we want to make sure that everybody understands the seriousness of it and takes the right precautions to be safe. So a question, this happened, I don't know what year it was, maybe 2008, it kept raining and raining, and then it would stop and then it would rain again. And I had a rose bush I couldn't keep alive. It just there was no way I could get it to drain, and it was just in standing water all the time. So, there are plants that are water plants that grow along the water's edge. And there are plants that are like the Blackfoot daisy and the Damianita that don't like to be in standing water. And then there's ones that are in between. So generally speaking, plants, like the regular average plants shouldn't be in standing water more than 2 days. Not saying there aren't exceptions to that, but they're not getting any oxygen, and at some point those roots are just going to suffocate. So you really can't you can plan ahead to have well-drained areas, but sometimes, you just like I said, in this case, that rose had been there for decades, and it was just in a kind of low spot, and it was heartbreaking. It was too big to dig up and move, and there really wasn't any way I could do to keep it aerated. So it was kind of sad. I know they were, Daphne had asked Skip about when you go into the nursery and how can you tell which plants are drought tolerant. And so actually I'm going to reinforce some of the things that Skip said and talk about a few other ways. So ways that plants deal with drought. One, they avoid it. I'll talk about that. Or they grow slowly, so they don't need as much. They have ways of storing it and saving it. They have an efficient photosynthesis cycle, because there's there's actually 3 different ways that plants photosynthesize. And then a big one is they reduce water loss through the transpiration of the water coming out of their leaves. And then there are a few other adaptations that I'm going to talk about. So avoiding it altogether. So how about if we just have a short life cycle? How about if we only grow when the water is available? And that's the definition of annual plants. So our annual wildflowers, if we get rain in the fall, they germinate and they grow throughout the winter. And like the bluebonnets are growing now, and they bloom in the spring. yay. And then they finish their cycle, they go to seed, they shut down, and then they just wait for more rain. So they've avoided needing to use water during the periods when there isn't water. Now, if we don't get water in the fall and those seeds are still sitting there, if we get some rain in the spring, the wildflowers, some of them still have a chance to bloom. They're not going to be as big. They're not going to be as extensive, but they were just waiting for that rain. A lot of it depends on when it rains. And I laugh because out at the Wildflower Center, I had someone who used to tell me, like, why don't we have more bluebonnets out here? Can't you make them grow? And I was like, yeah, no, I don't make them grow. That's not my job. But if you do want to know when the bluebonnets peak, generally it's the end of March, beginning of April. I used to get that question all the time. Okay, so another way that plants save water is they have these incredible underground storage systems. This is a spider lily, and I don't know if you know by looking at it what's going on underneath the ground, but you can see it's got lots of places where it can store moisture. So the top of this dies back or gets too hot, it's still got some reserves that it can come back. So another thing Skip had mentioned, succulents. So they store water in their leaves. That makes a lot of sense. Another way, I think this is kind of fun, they adapt as a water collection structure. So when it rains, where's all that water being directed? Right down to the base of that plant, right down there where the roots need to be. Now, if I was taking care of this landscape, I would probably pull those rocks away from the base of those plants a little bit more. I mean, it's not like having mulch up against them, but if it did stay wet too long, I could see the base of those plants rotting. So I would probably want to go in there and just pull them back so they're not, up against the base of that plant. And it's more important with bark mulch, but I could see where this, depending on what kind of year it is, if it's wet a lot, that could become a problem. And then just slow growing, some plants they just don't need a lot of water because they're not growing. And then just a quick review about transpiration and how that works, because that has a lot to do with the plant's ability to be drought tolerant. So I find this fascinating. This is a micron microscope picture of a leaf surface, and those are stomata. So those are little holes in the leaf surface. And so these holes are the same ones that are showing here in this diagram. So when the plant has a lot of water and it's turgid, those guard cells are plump and they open up. And so that allows for water exchange. When the plant is not hydrated, it closes so the plant won't lose water through its leaves. So that's a mechanism to keep water. So I'm going to show you some ways that the plants do that to save water. So one way is that they have gray leaves and they have hairy leaves, and that helps shade the top surface of the leaves, so not as much water comes out. So some good examples of that, these lovely little lamb's ears, great little plant, especially if you have kids. It's just, they're like lamb's ears, really wonderful. Woolly stomodia is a great native plant. Again, gray leaves, fuzzy leaves. And then Greg Dahlia is another one. That's a really great one for erosion control, because like Skip was saying with which plant he was talking about, bending it down and rooting it. Well, this does that all on its own. So these Greg Dahlia, they don't spread out a long ways, but if you plant a 1 gallon, it's going to keep growing out. But the roots, the stems root on the ground. Coralberry does that too. And so it really helps stabilize areas where you have erosion issues. Another great thing for those are just the grasses, the big muleys and stuff. They're great for erosion control too, because they have very fibrous roots. Another way that plants protect water loss is having a waxy coating on them. So this is an evergreen sumac, and you can see waxy leaves on it. So that helps reduce the water loss. Another thing that plants do, like in rosemary and desert willows, they have long, skinny leaves. They're just not as much surface area to lose the water from. And then no leaves. I think Skip mentioned this one too. Technically, these cacti pads, those are the stems of the plant. They aren't the leaves. So I know it's a technical thing, but it is the case. So this one doesn't have leaves, and that helps reduce the water loss during photosynthesis. And then spines is another way. Plants don't lose, sometimes animals will eat plants for their water. And so by having spines, that helps discourage animals from eating them. I like this slide. We share this slide in our youth education programs. And I just want to mention that, okay, this is how the root systems would be in the Blackland Prairie where there's deep soil, but you're not going to get the same response in West Austin where there's only this much soil. So I like to qualify that. But I can tell you that Bill Carson out at Native Texas Nursery, he has nurseries on the east side. He told me once they found Bermuda grass roots that were 16 feet deep. So that's kind of shocking, but I believe him because he's an honorable man. But I'm just saying this ideally is what it would look like underground. This is what the tall grass prairie looked like underground. And so we would like to emulate that as much as possible. But I think just we have to look at the soil depth. The soil depth that we have available to us varies quite a bit. So what really matters is what's happening out in your landscape and where you want to plant something. I hope you have some nice deep soil like that, but if not, then you need to adjust your plants accordingly. And then this also just reinforces what Daphne was saying about minimize the need for water by plants going dormant. This is not the same landscape, I want to be clear. And this is the most beautiful buffalo grass lawn I've ever seen. This is up in Northwest Hills. I took like 20 years ago, so I need to go back and see if it's still there. But I do know that the reason why that buffalo grass looks so great is because they amended their soil. It wasn't just 6 inches, it was like 10, 12 inches. And that's what turf grass needs to be, to be able to survive in our conditions. But the summer dormancy that, I think, I can't remember what Skip said Jill Noakes's color was, but mine is beige is also a color. That the plants, when they don't get any water, they will shut down, they will turn brown, and they will just wait until they get water. And that's the way we should be treating our turf grass landscapes. But people have to get used to that idea, and they have to understand that the turf grass isn't dead, right? It's dormant, and there's a difference. I'm going to stop there. I think I'm right on time, but I just hope that you have learned something about growing green. And when you do so, that you can spend more time chasing bubbles with your friends. And I really mean that too.
Thanks, everyone. That's all the time that we have for today. Skip, Denise, thank you so much for joining us today. Until next time, thank you for joining us and happy gardening.